Kia ora koutou, welcome along to this workshop this afternoon about revisioning your school camp. My name's Sophie Watson and it's great to have you along. So this workshop today is going to be based on some professional development that we have been running for the last couple of years. One workshop that we run is called Revisioning School Camps, of the very same name. And that has been now paired with a new workshop called DIY Camping. So both of those work together to support schools to revision their camps. So the information that I share today is going to be based on some ideas and tools that we share in that professional development. So you might be here at this workshop today for a variety of reasons. Perhaps you're here because you can see that your school camps, there's some room for innovation, or perhaps you're keen to try some different things and see what new ideas that you can create. Or perhaps you're here because the cost of camp has become prohibitive, or getting your students to camp is challenging, or perhaps you're struggling to get staff support. So whatever the reason why you're here today, hopefully by the end of the workshop, you'll have a few more ideas and tools about how you might go about revisioning your camp. So a little bit of information about me as we get started. So kei te whanganui a tara kainga nainei no whakatua hau, ko Sophie Watson tōku ingoa. So I originally come from the beautiful sunny Nelson, although they have been having a bit of a rough time there lately, but more sunny days than not. And so I have been living in Wellington for the last 10 years. So I moved from one seaside city to another. And for the last 10 years or so, I have been working in outdoor education. I was a high school teacher of PE, health and outdoor ed for quite a number of years. And more recently, in the last couple of years, I've been working for Eons as a professional development facilitator. And I also work at the moment for the New Zealand Council for Educational Research as a researcher. So that's a little bit about me. So to get us started, I thought it'd be good to have a bit of a think about your current situation. So I've got two questions there for you, and it would be great if you could have a think about them and then make a little note to yourself about what your responses are. If you're really keen, then you can share your ideas in the chat. That might get us some information about who's here and what things we might be able to share with each other. But the first question is, why does your school offer camp? So what do you and what do your colleagues hope that your camps will provide ākonga? So that's a really key question. So have a think about that. And then the second question is, what is your golden nugget of camp? So what I mean by that is camp is a really magical time for most of our staff and students. And so what is it to you that is that particular magic, or what is that particular gold that comes out of camp for you? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to just quickly reflect on those two questions. No doubt there's many golden nuggets, and it's about a tricky thing of trying to decide which ones are on top for you. Okay, great. I'm just going to keep things moving because we have got a little bit to get through, but I do encourage you to think about these questions, maybe take a quick screenshot now or a photo so that you can come back and refer to these questions later. Okay, what I'd like to invite you to do now is to draw up this table. So there are three columns: a keep column, a change column, and what I call an emo column, which is explore, missing, or opportunities. And so as we go through the workshop, I would encourage you to jot down any ideas that you have or reflections that you have about your school camps and the ideas that we talk about today. So there'll be things that you might want to keep in your current camps. There might be things that you want to change. There might be things that you've realised that you're missing, or you want to explore what other opportunities there might be. So this table can help you kind of just gather your thoughts and think about your next steps. Okay, hopefully everyone's had a chance to create that table. So the way that this workshop, we've structured it today, is the image in front of you is a tool that we share within our DIY camping workshop. And this is not only a really great way to think about how we might go about planning our camp, the process that we go about planning our camp, but also some critical elements as part of that. So often what happens is that when we plan camp, we start with the camp activity. So what activities do we want our students to do on camp? Perhaps we might be going to a residential camp setting and they've got a suite of activities that we can choose from, and that's our starting place. I'd really like to challenge you to flip that on its head. So when we're planning camp, we actually really want to be starting with the camp vision, the why. Like all our learning that we design for our konga, we always need to know the why, and that's to make sure that what we're designing is actually going to be achieving what we're hoping it to achieve, and also so that we just have that really clear in our mind. How is this relevant? How is this important? So this worksheet that we deliver and that we're going to go through today starts with the camp vision. So it's designed that you start at the center of the circles here and you make your way out. So we're going to be going through that process together. So on that note, we're going to start with the first thing that we should be doing, which is looking at the camp vision or the purpose of camp. I'll just minimize myself so you can see this more easily. Okay, so it's really important, like I said, that we start with this, so that this is like our touchstone for everything that we design around our school camp. So first thing you want to do is to reflect on, like the question that we had at the start of this workshop, why does your school offer camp? What is the purpose that you want your students, or what do you want your students to walk away with by the end of their camp experience? And how does that fit into your school vision and goal? So all of our learning that we design, it should always reflect what our school hopes our students will achieve more generally. So what I recommend that teams do when they're looking at revisioning their camp is that they have their school charter, perhaps their student graduate profile, vision, goals, all that kind of stuff. And then they compare that with, what is the purpose of camp? And you should see some synergy or some coherency between those two things, so that you're building on kind of the kaupapa of your school through school camp. So that's the first thing, reflecting on the purpose and how does that align with the rest of your school's kind of vision and purpose. When you're reflecting on your vision, it's really important that you think of the students that are in front of you. So we want to be thinking about, school camps are often grounded in a lot of tradition, which is super special. And particularly, if you've got ākonga who have had siblings come through the school, they might, reminisce really positively about their camp experience, and their siblings also want to have that same experience. Or perhaps your whānau, they really want their children to have similar experiences. But we also want to be thinking about how those traditions, whether they still align with the purpose of camp, for the ākonga that are in front of you now, and how those traditions might be influencing what students are experiencing on camp at the moment. So how are those traditions, if we think about them, perhaps you have always gone to the same location, or perhaps you've always had these particular activities done on camp. That might be great and you might want to keep that, but it's worth reflecting on how does that align and how does that fit with what we want camp to serve our young people now. We also want to think about how and who you've involved in the planning process. So that's not just, around your vision, but it's around the design, the implementation, the ongoing learning associated with camp. Who's involved in that and what kind of power do they have in decision making? So as you do when you create your school charter and you consult with the community, camp is an extension of, that kind of consultation process that should be happening. And that way it really reflects what our community and what our ākonga would like for themselves and what they see as important. You also want to be thinking about how your camps are integrated with other learning experiences. So often I see that school camp is an isolated experience. So it's, a one-off, and maybe we might do some writing or reading reflections post-camp, but it doesn't really connect to much else or other things that our students might be learning or wanting to learn throughout the year. And, there are some fine things about that, but we're also missing huge opportunity when we have camp as a solo experience. So how are you, or how could you integrate camp into the rest of your ākonga's schooling experience? So this is the first thing that we want to nail down. And when we have this, And it's so much easier to build a camp that's really in a line and in step with this, and we can create really beautiful experiences that mean a lot and are relevant for our ākonga. The second thing we want to do, so we're moving outside the next ring of the circle on that first diagram that I showed you, is thinking about the place that we're in. So sometimes we might go to a camp and that's a really distant place from where our school is based, and we go there and then we come home and yeah, it was a great experience, but we haven't really connected to that place, or there's no opportunity for us to visit again, or we might not really think deeply about who's been there in that place before us. And again, when we think about the place that camp is in, there's some amazing learning opportunities that learning about place presents. So whether your camp is at a residential setting or whether that's a journey-based camp, so you might be journeying through place, whether it's a multi-day camp where students go home at the end of each night and then visit a different location another day, or whether your camp is on school grounds, it's really worthwhile looking at what features of that place exist. So this is what I like to call the exploring phase of your camp planning. So this activity that I'm just about to describe, I'm going to describe it really briefly, but we do go into it in a lot more detail in our professional development that we offer. So what I recommend you do, and you can do this just for education outside the classroom, EOTC more generally, so you might want to identify what opportunities your local places present. But for this, I'm just going to pretend we're at a camp setting. So Ngā Puna Wai Sports Hub, that's going to be our camp. So what I've done is I've printed out a map with our camp location at the centre, and you can vary this a little bit, but I recommend that you have like a 2-kilometre radius from that camp setting and a 5 to 10 kilometre radius of that camp setting. So we've kind of captured what we see on the screen here. And then you're going to use this map as a way of exploring what is there by asking some key questions. Now, you can do this activity with your staff as a planning tool and kind of brainstorming, what do we know about this place? What opportunities might be there that we've missed before? Who are our critical contacts in these places? But you can also do it with students, and it's a really great way of students connecting with each other, sharing their own experiences that they might have had in this place. And also, if you want to bring students more into the planning of camp, this is another great activity that you can do with them. So you printed out this map, and then what you're going to do is you're going to start asking some questions, and you identify specific locations on the map in relation to these questions. So you might be thinking about, what is the history of this place? Maybe that's for traditional Māori events or history. Perhaps there might be colonial history or European history. Perhaps that might be a more recent history. So what are specific spots that have key history events that have taken place there? You want to think about what is here in that place. So facilities, place features, maybe you've got a really amazing volcano that used to be there. Perhaps you've got a lake. You might have a swimming pool facility or a rock climbing facility. Or perhaps there's a really marshy wetland there. So we want to be identifying features of that place, what's there. You might want to be thinking about what stories and memories do people have of that place. And this is the really beautiful part where you start to make connections and go, oh yeah, I've had a similar experience. Or, oh my gosh, I've lived down the road from that and I never knew it existed. So this is really cool for identifying, what knowledge is present with the people that you're working with and what kind of personal connection do they have to that place. We might be thinking about what we could learn about in this place. What kind of learning does this place facilitate? And what could we learn about this place? Maybe there's a purpose behind learning about it. Perhaps we could contribute back to that place. And thinking about what activities we could do, what tikanga the place requires, how the community engages with place. You can basically make up any question you like, but it's about exploring what this place offers. So then you've got this map and you've got all these beautiful ideas about how you could use that for EOTC or for your camp purposes. So how might you actually embed that into a camp experience? Well, perhaps you actually want your students to be familiar with that place before they go there on camp because they're going to do different activities. So you might get them, particularly if it's a local place, to go there really regularly or engage with that place at different times of the year to see how the seasons might change that place. or to have a different lens when they go to that place. So the first time they might go and look at the history. The second time, perhaps when they're on camp, they might be looking at how they might contribute to that place. So we want to start thinking about how we can use place in different ways. That might be more challenging if you're going to a residential camp that's further away, but you could do a contrast and compare, how is the camp that we're going to, the camp setting that we're going to, different from our place? What are the similarities and differences? Why is that? So you can use place in really magical ways. Like we've talked about before, you can encourage students to consider the place in depth. And so when we're starting to really think deeply about place, we're not just moving through place and not really thinking about it, but that's adding on the richness of what that learning opportunity presents. And thinking about the activities that can take place in this particular setting. So, sometimes if we go on camp, we might just do it, a particular activity. Let's say we might do a high ropes, or we might do a tramp. We could be anywhere doing those activities, but we want to start thinking about how could we bring the uniqueness of that place to life, in our camp setting using this particular place. So starting to think a bit more critically about how we engage with place. The third thing we want to think about in that circle is community expertise. So I often hear that it's really difficult, particularly in some school communities, to get parent support, and I completely understand that, and it's becoming more of a challenge as people become more stretched financially. But there's a huge wealth of experience, of knowledge, of access to different places in your community. So you definitely want to be talking with your ākonga, because no doubt they've had experiences in place that they can, share some of their own knowledge, and that's a great way of encouraging students to step into leadership, and it's also really important for power sharing and reciprocity of knowledge. We want to definitely be talking with whānau. What do you know about this place? That's great for building strong connections with your whānau community, as well as having these kind of conversations. And perhaps you might have interested whānau come along to a pre-camp evening where you actually discuss your ideas about the purpose of camp or the place that you're going to, and you could run a really nice brainstorming session with whānau. We could definitely draw on, mana whenua knowledge and experience of place. Huge wealth of information available there, but you obviously need to make sure that it's a reciprocal relationship. So I'd be drawing on the connections that your school already has with mana whenua, and being aware not to overload or have unfair expectations placed on their engagement. Scouting groups, businesses, organisations, local councils, Department of Conservation, educators. There's a huge array of people that you can draw on here, and that we often don't think about, particularly if we go to a residential camp setting. And I'm saying residential camp setting quite often, and I'm not meaning that in a negative sense. We do need residential camps, but we want to start trying to build a bit more of a diverse camp experience with our residential camp facilitators. So if we're going to a residential camp, perhaps we might bring in external expertise to help us with particular knowledge, or maybe your residential camp staff actually know a lot about place, and you say, hey, could we just talk about the history of this place before we do this particular activity? Or is there a way that our ākonga could contribute to your camp by planting trees or clearing out waterways or doing some testing to see, what is the quality of the soil here? So, thinking in diverse ways about how we draw on the community expertise. The pictures that are on the screen here, they're from one of our case study schools, Waterloo School in Lower Hutt in Wellington. And so they've been going through a revisioning process with their year 5 and 6 camp. And so they actually did their camp over multiple days. And the camp culminated on an overnight camping experience on school grounds. Now, I know some people are like, yes, camping on school grounds is awesome, and some people have reservations about safety and things like that. But the lead teacher who was organising this camp really drew on community expertise to support them in this. So the story of this camp is that the school was looking at atua and what atua were present in their school grounds. Where does Tangaroa most fit within their school grounds? Does Tangaroa fit in their school grounds? Where might you find Tāne in our school grounds? And then they expanded that to their local areas. So they then looked at, well, Tangaroa might not be present in our school, but whereabouts in our region is Tangaroa present? And so they would go to different sites within their region and explore local places with the lens of Māori Atua. So they drew on local council to help identify street names and the meanings of places. They had dock workers talk to them about the history of places and biodiversity that existed in different Atua spaces. When it came to camping on school grounds, the lead teacher drew on scouts to help provide tents for the camp. And they also did a bit of reciprocity where they allowed the scout group who had a den behind the school to use their Wi-Fi at night time so that they could do digital badging. And then the scouts came over and supported the fire pit for marshmallow roasting during camp. So there's a really nice relationship that's been built there, and it meant that staff didn't feel like they had to do everything themselves or have that knowledge. And there were also, really nice structures in place that meant that things were well managed and not overloading staff. So scouts were brought in to help with the tents, help pitch the tents, take down the tents, provided the tents, and also supported with the fire pit. The school also brought in the local police to do patrols around the perimeter of the school, like they just drive by every now and then to check that everything was okay. So they were also involved, and that was really nice for the students to see, police in a positive light and contributing to the school. And they also borrowed tents from a local school. So there were lots of community connections that were made, and that helped to build the richness of the camp, build community connections, and also built ongoing relationship and reciprocity. The fourth thing we want to be thinking about is our curriculum links. So, we're thinking about the purpose of our camp and what our students need to learn or what the place offers in terms of learning opportunities. And obviously local curriculum, like I've already said, in Aotearoa New Zealand histories are perfect curriculums to bring into your camp experience. So they're obviously just two examples, but our national curriculums, they certainly have so many opportunities. And I would encourage you not just to think about the key competencies of our curriculum, the New Zealand curriculum, and drawing on those in your camp, but actually your learning areas. How might you bring those into your camp experience? So what I would really encourage you to think about is, what do your students need to be fully present to succeed on camp? So often we take students to camp and we're like, right, now you're in this new environment and we expect you to do all these crazy new things and to feel really good about that and to learn all these new things. And our students most certainly do, but camp can also be a very overwhelming experience. And so rather than expecting our students to kind of perform on camp, we can preload their learning and their confidence that they really thrive on camp in a different way we might not usually see. So that means that we need to think about, what do our students need to thrive on camp, and build a learning program and prepare them for that before camp takes place. And I've got an example of a school that's done this, and I'll share that with you in a moment. We want to be thinking about, like I've talked about before, the place and the student experiences to design the purpose and activities of camp. So that pre-post learning, it depends on what time of year you have your school camp. If it's at the start of the year, then you can definitely draw back on those learning experiences in really authentic ways throughout your learning program throughout the year. So think about how you might set that up before you go on camp, so it's not this retrospective thing and your students are struggling to remember a particular detail of camp. You want to be finding the natural synergies and connections between learning areas and skills and behaviours and approaches, and explicitly teach them. So rather than, our students most certainly absorb a whole lot of information and learning on camp, but if there's something that we want our students to get out, particularly, we need to be explicitly teaching that and building that into a learning program. And that doesn't have to be a huge amount of work. It might just mean tweaking some activities that you're already doing in your maths program or in your literacy program or perhaps in your science program, and framing that so that it's built around your camp experience. And it's also a really great way to build inquiry and real world problems into your camp experience. So perhaps you might be going on camp at a local setting, and when your students were on camp, they realized that, oh my gosh, there's no bird life. We heard no birds. Why is that? And so then that might be a really great starting place for a science investigation, which obviously can bring in a whole lot of different other learning areas. So start to think about more broadly, what kind of opportunities does camp present and what might you explicitly need to teach and what could you then build on further post-camp? So the images that you can see here, they're pictures of student work from one of our case study schools, which is Churton Park Primary School. That's also based in Pornicky in Wellington. And this, the lead teacher of this camp, this was a year 5-6 camp, she noticed that her ākonga were really struggling when they got to camp. So there was a lot of homesickness, some bedwetting, and students just kind of appeared, not all students, but some students really kind of struggled to find their mojo during camp. And so she thought, are we actually preparing our students properly for camp so that it's a really rich learning experience for them? So she designed a pre-camp gamified program. So this basically, students were tasked with creating a board game about camp, and this was done in a really structured way. So what this teacher, Leanne, did was that she first asked students to do some self-reflection, and they were to design a character card. And so this was based on themselves. And as part of this, they had to obviously do some artwork, but they thought about, what qualities do I have that can support my peers during camp? What support might I need? And so they built kind of character traits, and that was built into these character cards. Then she did a mapping activity, which brought in some numeracy and some literacy and some artwork, where she described what camp looked like, and students had to build a map of camp based on that. So that meant that students were really familiar with the camp environment and the kind of elements that were present at camp. And it also meant that they then had a map that they could use for their game. She then designed some scenarios. So they talked about, what are some things that you're worried about happening on camp? And so students, she had a range of things. Oh, I'm really worried about spiders. I'm really worried about being hungry. I'm really worried about if there's a storm. What happens if I have no friends? And so rather than kind of just dismissing these student ideas or not really unpacking them fully, they went through each scenario and talked about, what is the best case and the worst case scenario. And so students then had already kind of thought about how they might manage or respond to these situations if they happen on camp. And they came up with their own scenarios and own solutions. And these became their kind of like scenario cards for their board game. So this is obviously a really quick overview, but there were multiple things that students had to do as part of this pre-camp program that helped them prepare for camp and brought in a whole lot of amazing learning. So then students had their games designed, they had these different elements, they played the games, and then they went on camp. And Leanne said that the difference between the students was remarkable. Pretty much all students felt really comfortable. They kind of had more confidence to step into different activities. A storm actually happened on camp, and rather than freaking out, the students said, oh, well, what's the best case, worst case scenario? And worked through that. And she was just blown away by the difference. So it goes to show, our students can thrive on camp without, some of our students can thrive on camp without that pre-camp support and learning. But actually, are we doing our students a disservice by not really building that into their experience, giving them some more tools to really thrive? So now I've thought about, what is the purpose of camp? What does our camp location offer us? And what community expertise can we draw on? What learning can take place, considering all those things? And the last thing we want to think about are the learning activities. So this is, the activities that are taking place on camp. And this is the last thing that we want to be thinking about. So all those different ideas are funneling into, distilling our ideas, and our activities fall out the bottom. And so this means that we're really critically thinking about, oh yeah, how does this activity work for our purpose? How is this activity supporting our students? How are our students able to demonstrate their knowledge during this activity? So it's much more intentional. And that means that the value that you're getting of camp is much higher. You might still have some of those activities that you love dearly, that students love dearly, but perhaps you're bringing in a different element. You know, for instance, rather than getting rid of the high ropes, what could you add to the high ropes that means that the learning that students are getting from that activity is much more diverse and rich? So that's the process that we go through. Now, this has obviously been a really quick process, and I just want to remind you that this is just one way that we could think about planning our camp and some elements we might want to consider. I also just want to talk about equity. So obviously this is a really critical thing that we consider across all our students' learning experiences and time at school, but also on camp. So if we take a back step and think about, well, what does equity mean on camp? So it's about thinking what learning opportunities are our students exposed to during camp? Are there activities that always seem to be happening on camp? Do our students across their schooling experience and across EOTC and school camps, do they get a breadth of activities, or does it seem to be the same kind of activities that are happening on camp? Which learning activities and opportunities are favoured in school camp situations and which are missing? And if we look at the breadth of a time that a student is at school, you know, what opportunities are favoured and which are missing? So taking a bit of a step back and reflecting on that. We obviously want to be making sure that camp is a safe space for all of our konga. So thinking about those students that are a bit less confident in the outdoors or in new spaces or away from home or having to work with different students. So making sure that we are actually providing differentiated activities and meaningful alternatives. Thinking about also gender inclusivity of camp. So perhaps you might have some rainbow students in your camps. How are you thinking about and providing for them? Perhaps if you're doing rock climbing or if you're doing some water activities and bodies are being exposed or it's harder to maintain body privacy, how are you making sure that students feel safe in that space? And obviously sleeping arrangements comes into this too, and we've got some great information on our website, and Inside Out does too, about how to manage sleeping arrangements if you've got some rainbow students. We want to be thinking about cultural and religious practices and approaches, so making sure that we're catering for students with different eating needs, or perhaps there's a particular practice around prayer that they need to maintain. So how are you embedding that into the experience and providing for that? But also about different cultural and religious knowledge. But perhaps your student has a huge wealth of knowledge about ngahere or rongoa, so about the bush and about different plants that can be used. Perhaps they have amazing knowledge about the history of that place. Perhaps they're really skilled at doing a particular activity and they can share that knowledge. So we want to be thinking about how we can bring that in. And then we also want to be reflecting about the cost of camp. So camp can be hugely expensive depending on what's involved. And so you want to be thinking about, you know, if you're going away and you're spending, you know, $300 per person on this camp, are you really getting your bang for your buck? You know, if it's only a 3-day camp and it's costing $300, that's, you know, a reasonable amount. So you want to make sure that the learning experience are huge and that it's not just a one-off event, that you can draw on the richness of that experience throughout the whole year. But I'd be definitely thinking critically about that, and localizing your camp is a great way of managing costs. People often say, oh, yeah, but I feel like my students aren't going to be as stoked about that, or they're going to not engage as much because it's familiar. But you'd be surprised. Many of the workshops that we've run, people have kind of had a bit of an initial resistance to thinking about, oh, I don't want to localize my camp, my students won't enjoy it. But when we take them through the different activities they could do in that place, or the learning that links to that place, or they have actually had to go and deliver a local camp, they can really see the benefit. So I'd encourage you to just be a little bit bold, maybe not, you know, do things completely different the first year, but just try things out and see how your community responds, how your ākonga respond. So thinking about your next steps. So I'd really like you to go back and think about your why and the golden nugget of camp that you identified at the start of this presentation. And so thinking about those things and what you wrote down, I want you to now ask yourself, how does the why of camp, the purpose of your camp currently, and your golden nuggets, how do they come to life currently? You know, can you really see them? Can you see them for all students? Are there any things that you now think could be missing or could be added to your camp? Is the purpose or purposes and your golden nugget, are they visible in the planning and teaching of camp as well as post camp? So it's not just in the solo experience of camp itself. How could those visions, those purposes of camp, how could they be further enhanced? And really critically, is the purpose of camp still relevant for your ākonga? You know, so much has changed in our environment, in our society. You know, is the purpose that perhaps was written 5, 10, maybe even longer ago, is that still relevant? Is that the purpose of camp last year still relevant for the students you have in front of you today? And if the purpose changed, that doesn't necessarily mean that the whole camp needs to be thrown out. We really want to be taking a strengths-based approach with your revisioning process. So thinking about, you know, what are the great things that are happening? How does that align with your purpose? You know, you might have an amazing camp that's doing really well, but there's one particular aspect that could be built on. And more importantly, how are you involving your ākonga in this process in really genuine ways? So thinking about what do they see should be an important learning outcome for them for camp? How are they involved in the planning of camp? And depending on the age of your students, you know, younger students might not be able to make big decisions, but they certainly can have some say apart from, you know, what should we have for dinner? You want to be thinking about how students can contribute more to the design of camp in terms of activities or, you know, where the direction of their learning goes next. So I've thrown a whole lot of ideas at you. I have no doubt that there might be some questions. So if you do have questions, then stay on the line now and we'll have a bit of a conversation. But otherwise, you can send me an email at pld@eons.org.nz. And like I said at the start of the presentation, we have 2 workshops, the revisioning school camps and the DIY camping. We have 3 workshops happening for the rest of this year in Invercargill, Levin and Auckland. And we will also be planning some more for next year. So I recommend that you go onto our website and have a look at those if you're interested and sign up. It will be great to see you there. So thank you so much for coming along today. Hopefully that was helpful and enjoy the rest of your evening. Ka kite.